The crowd fell silent as Zachariah Morgan's hand came down hard on Zoe Cooper's cheek, the sound echoing through the town hall of Wallace, Idaho, like a gunshot. Her refusal of his marriage proposal, delivered with such public confidence, had humiliated the most powerful man in the mining territory, and he would make her pay for it. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his face contorted with rage. "No woman refuses me, especially not a penniless schoolteacher." Zoe stumbled backward, her hand pressed against her stinging face, but her blue eyes remained defiant. It was 1882, and while a woman had few rights in the Idaho territory, she would not surrender the one choice she still possessed: whom to marry. "I would rather die alone than spend one day as your wife," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her body. The assembled townsfolk murmured uncomfortably. No one moved to help her. Zachariah Morgan owned the largest silver mine in the Coeur d'Alene district, employed half the town, and had the mayor and sheriff in his pocket. Crossing him meant ruin. "Then alone you shall be," Morgan sneered, adjusting his expensive waistcoat. "I wonder how long the school board will keep a teacher who's been labeled a woman of questionable virtue." From the back of the hall, a tall figure stepped forward. Dust covered his denim pants and leather vest, and a worn cowboy hat shadowed his face. Blake Miller had ridden into town just yesterday, a stranger passing through who had stopped only to rest his horse and perhaps find work. No one knew anything about him, which made his intervention all the more surprising. "That's enough," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable steel. The lady said no. Morgan turned, astonished that anyone would dare interrupt his public chastisement. "This isn't your concern, stranger. Move along before you find yourself in trouble." Blake took another step forward, pushing his hat back to reveal piercing green eyes and a face weathered by sun and wind. "I reckon making threats to a lady in public makes it everybody's concern." The wealthy mine owner's face darkened. "You know who I am." "Don't much care," Blake replied, now standing beside Zoe, "but I know what you are, a man who can't take no for an answer." Morgan's hand moved toward his inside pocket, but Blake was faster, his coat pushed back just enough to reveal a holstered Colt. "I wouldn't," Blake cautioned. "Not here." After a tense moment, Morgan turned to Zoe. "You've made your choice, Miss Cooper. Report to the school board tomorrow to turn in your resignation, and vacate your lodgings by week's end. The property belongs to my company." As Morgan and his associates swept from the hall, the townspeople began to disperse, some casting sympathetic glances at Zoe but none offering help. She stood rigid, dignity intact despite the red mark blooming on her cheek. "Thank you," she said finally, turning to the cowboy. "But you shouldn't have done that. You don't understand what he can do." Blake shrugged. "I've met his type before. They only have power if folks give it to them." He studied her face. "You need something cold for that cheek." Zoe touched her face gingerly. "What I need is a miracle." "He'll make good on his threats. I'll lose my position and my home." "No one forces you into anything again," Blake said firmly. "Not while I'm around." Zoe looked up at him, confusion crossing her features. "You're passing through. You'll be gone tomorrow." Blake Miller gazed out the windows of the town hall toward the rugged mountains surrounding the mining town. "Maybe I'll stay a while. Seems like this place could use someone willing to stand up to a bully." "You don't know what you're saying," Zoe warned. "Zachariah Morgan doesn't forget or forgive. He'll destroy you." A smile touched Blake's lips, revealing a small scar at the corner of his mouth. "He can try, Miss Cooper. He can surely try." The following morning, Zoe stood before the school board, 5 men seated at a long table in the town's municipal building. Chairman Edwards, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Cooper, It has come to our attention that there have been concerns about your moral character. Zoe gripped her hands tightly together. If by concerns you mean Mr. Morgan's anger that I declined his proposal, then yes, I suppose there are concerns. Another board member, Peterson, leaned forward. Now, Miss Cooper, Mr. Morgan has been most generous to this community. The new school building was largely funded by his donations. And does that donation include ownership of the schoolteacher? Zoe asked, fighting to keep her voice level. The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Edwards removed his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief. We must consider the well-being of the children, he said. If there are questions about a teacher's reputation. There were no questions about my reputation until yesterday, Zoe pointed out. I've taught in this town for 3 years without a single complaint. Nevertheless, Edwards continued, replacing his spectacles, we feel it would be best if you tendered your resignation, effective immediately. The door to the meeting room opened and Blake Miller stepped in, hat in hand. The board members looked up in surprise at the interruption. Gentlemen, Blake said with a nod, I apologize for intruding, but I believe I have information relevant to your discussion. Edwards frowned. Sir, this is a private meeting. I'll be quick, Blake promised. I just wanted to inform you that I've purchased the Blackwell claim. A murmur ran through the room. The Blackwell claim was a silver mine just outside town that had been abandoned when old Jacob Blackwell died the previous winter. It had shown promise, but required investment to develop. What does this have to do with school business? Peterson demanded. Well, Blake said casually, as a new property owner and businessman in Wallace, I have an interest in the quality of education here, and I've heard that Miss Cooper is an exceptional teacher. Mr. Miller, Edwards began, while we appreciate your interest, the board has already, I also understand, Blake continued as if he hadn't heard, that Morgan Mining holds the note on the school building. I'd like to offer to pay that note in full, transferring ownership to the town proper. Stunned silence filled the room. Zoe stared at the cowboy in disbelief. That's most generous, Edwards stammered. But Mr. Morgan shouldn't have any say in school matters if he no longer holds financial influence over the institution, Blake finished. I believe in separation of business and education. The board members huddled together, whispering urgently. Zoe moved closer to Blake. What are you doing? She whispered. You can't just buy a mine and pay off the school's debt. Blake looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Actually, I can, and I did. The papers were signed this morning. But why? You don't know me, you don't owe me anything. Before he could answer, Edwards called for attention. Mr. Miller, the board would need to discuss your offer in detail, as for Miss Cooper's position. He hesitated, clearly recalculating the political landscape. Perhaps we were hasty. We could table the matter for further consideration. I think that would be wise, Blake said. I'd hate to see a good teacher lost over a personal matter. When they left the building, Zoe stopped on the boardwalk, forcing Blake to face her. I don't understand. Who are you really? Nobody rides into town and buys a mine on a whim. Blake adjusted his hat against the morning sun. I wasn't entirely truthful about being just a passing cowboy. I've been looking at mining properties throughout the territory. The Blackwell claim has been on my list for some time. So this wasn't about helping me. Let's say the timing worked out well for both of us. He offered a half smile. You keep your job, at least temporarily, and I acquire a property I wanted anyway. Zoe wasn't convinced. Morgan won't take this lightly. He wanted that claim himself but was waiting for the price to drop further. Then he waited too long. A wagon rattled past, drawing their attention momentarily. When Zoe looked back at Blake, her expression had softened slightly. Thank you, Mr. Miller, regardless of your motives. But you should know that buying a mine in a school building won't be enough to stop Zachariah Morgan. He still owns my boarding house. By week's end, I'll have nowhere to live." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "One problem at a time, Miss Cooper. One problem at a time." Later that afternoon, Zoe returned to Mrs. Hollister's boarding house to find her belongings piled unceremoniously on the porch. The elderly widow wrung her hands anxiously as she explained, "I'm so sorry, dear. Mr. Morgan's man came by with papers showing he's purchased the mortgage on the property. Said I had to evict you immediately or face eviction myself." Tears filled her eyes. "All my other boarders are minors dependent on Morgan wages. I can't risk—" "It's all right, Mrs. Hollister," Zoe said gently, though her heart raced with panic. "You had no choice." Gathering her meager possessions, 2 trunks containing clothes, books, and personal items, Zoe wondered where she would go. The town had only one hotel, also owned by Morgan interests, and few residents would risk offering her shelter. As she contemplated her options, a wagon pulled up in front of the boarding house. Blake Miller sat at the reins. "Need some help with those trunks?" he asked, as if finding her possessions on the street was nothing unusual. "Mr. Miller," Zoe acknowledged, wariness in her voice. "News travels fast. Small town." He climbed down from the wagon. "I've arranged temporary accommodations, if you'll allow me to assist you." Zoe hesitated. "I appreciate your help, but I can't accept housing from a man I barely know. My reputation is already in question." Blake loaded one of her trunks into the wagon despite her protest. "The accommodations are with the widow Abernathy at the edge of town. She's agreed to rent you her spare room. I'm just providing transportation." Mrs. Abernathy's farm is outside Morgan's direct influence, Zoe realized. "But how did you arrange this so quickly? Her late husband and I served together briefly. Military connections can be useful." He lifted the second trunk. "Will you come, or would you prefer to spend the night on Mrs. Hollister's porch?" With few alternatives, Zoe climbed onto the wagon seat. As they traveled through town, she felt eyes watching from every window and doorway. Word of her rejection of Morgan and subsequent punishment had spread like wildfire. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked as they left the town's main street behind. "And don't tell me it's just good timing again." Blake kept his eyes on the road. "I have my reasons for disliking men like Morgan, men who believe their money entitles them to whatever or whoever they want. There's more to it than that." He glanced at her, then back at the road. "Let's just say I've seen what happens when powerful men force choices on those with less power. I don't stand for it." Mrs. Abernathy's farm was modest but well kept, with a small orchard and vegetable garden behind the main house. The widow herself, a robust woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, welcomed Zoe warmly. "Any friend of Blake's is welcome here," she said, showing Zoe to a small but comfortable bedroom. "And don't you worry about that Morgan fellow. My property's been paid off for 15 years. He has no hold here." After Blake had carried in her trunks and declined Mrs. Abernathy's invitation to stay for dinner, Zoe walked him back to his wagon. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I don't know what I would have done. You'd have figured something out. You strike me as resourceful." Zoe watched as he prepared to leave. "Mr. Miller, I still don't understand why you're going to such lengths. Buying a mine, arranging housing for me. It seems excessive for someone you just met." Blake paused, one foot on the wagon step. "When I rode into Wallace yesterday, I saw a pretty town with ugly underpinnings. One man controlling everything, everyone afraid to step out of line." He shook his head. "Then I saw you stand up to him, refusing to be bought or intimidated, and I thought there's someone worth fighting for." The simple honesty in his words caught Zoe off guard. Before she could respond, he climbed into the wagon. "I'll be by tomorrow to take you to the school," he said, "unless you'd prefer to make other arrangements." "No," she said quickly. "That would be most appreciated." As she watched him drive away, Zoe felt a confusion of emotions. Gratitude, certainly, but also a growing curiosity about the mysterious cowboy who had upended Zachariah Morgan's carefully constructed control over her life, and perhaps over the entire town of Wallace. The next morning, when Blake arrived to take her to the schoolhouse, Zoe was ready and waiting, dressed in her most professional blue dress, her light brown hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. "You look prepared for battle," Blake observed as he helped her into the wagon. "In a way I am," she replied. "The children will have heard all sorts of stories by now, and some parents may not be pleased to see me." "Then they can take their children elsewhere," Blake said firmly. Zoe smiled despite her nerves. "There is no elsewhere in Wallace, Mr. Miller. We have one school." When they arrived at the small white schoolhouse, Zoe was relieved to see most of her students already waiting outside. Several parents stood nearby, watching carefully but making no move to remove their children. "I'll be at the mine most of the day," Blake told her. "But I'll return to escort you back to Mrs. Abernathy's." Zoe nodded, grateful yet uncertain about his continued presence in her life. As she walked toward the schoolhouse, one of the waiting fathers stepped forward, Michael Jenkins, who worked as a foreman at Morgan's mine. "Miss Cooper," he said, his expression troubled. "Some folks are saying you've taken up with this stranger to spite Mr. Morgan." Zoe felt her face flush. "Mr. Miller has merely offered assistance when the rest of the town turned its back. There is nothing improper between us." Jenkins lowered his voice. "Morgan's furious. Says he'll close sections of the mine if people keep supporting you. A lot of families can't afford to lose that income." "I'm sorry to hear that," Zoe said sincerely, "but I won't be forced into marriage to keep my position or to protect anyone else's. That's not a fair burden to place on me." The man nodded reluctantly. "Just thought you should know what you're up against." Throughout the day, Zoe maintained her composure, focusing on the children's education rather than the whispers and rumors spreading through town. By afternoon, however, she was exhausted from the strain of pretending everything was normal. When Blake returned as promised, she was sitting alone at her desk, grading arithmetic papers. "Rough day?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Zoe set down her pencil. "Morgan is threatening to cut jobs at the mine because of me." Blake entered the classroom, taking a seat on one of the children's benches. "He's bluffing. He won't reduce production and lose profits just to punish you. You don't know that, and even if it's a bluff, people believe it. They're scared." She looked up at him. "I'm scared too, not just for myself, but for what this is doing to the town." "Fear is how men like Morgan maintain control," Blake said. "Break that fear and his power diminishes. That's easy to say when you have resources. I had nothing but my reputation, and now even that's being questioned." Blake studied her for a moment. "Tell me something, Miss Cooper. If Morgan hadn't threatened your job and home, would you still have refused him?" "Without hesitation," she answered immediately. "The man is cruel and controlling. I've seen how he treats people he considers beneath him." "Then stand by that decision. The consequences aren't your fault, they are his choice, his attempt to punish you for exercising the one freedom you had." Zoe gathered her papers slowly. "You speak as if you've experienced something similar." A shadow crossed Blake's face. "My sister was pressured into marrying a wealthy rancher in Montana Territory. He seemed respectable enough at first, but once married, his true nature emerged." His jaw tightened. "She died 2 years later. The official report called it an accident." "I'm so sorry," Zoe said softly, understanding now some of his motivation. "And the rancher never faced justice," Blake replied, his voice hard. He had too many friends in high places, but he lost everything else eventually: his ranch, his standing. I made sure of that. The admission hung in the air between them. Zoe realized she was seeing beneath the calm exterior to the determined man beneath. Is that what you intend for Morgan? To take everything from him? Blake stood, offering his hand to help her from her chair. I intend to show Wallace that no one man should control an entire town's destiny, or a woman's choice of husband. As they left the schoolhouse together, neither noticed the figure watching from the shadows of nearby buildings, one of Morgan's men, taking note of their every interaction. The following Sunday, Zoe attended church services in the small white chapel that served the Wallace community. She sat beside Mrs. Abernathy, conscious of the glances and whispers from other parishioners. Blake had declined to join them, saying he had business matters to attend to at the mine. After the service, as Zoe and Mrs. Abernathy prepared to leave, Reverend Phillips approached them. "Miss Cooper, might I have a word?" he asked, his expression grave. "Of course, Reverend." He led her to a quiet corner of the churchyard. "I'm concerned about your association with Mr. Miller." "There are rumors circulating, rumors spread by Zachariah Morgan because I refuse to marry him," Zoe interrupted, her patience wearing thin. "Mr. Miller has been a gentleman and nothing more," the Reverend sighed. "Be that as it may, appearances matter. A young, unmarried woman spending time with a mysterious newcomer, it raises questions. And what of Mr. Morgan's behavior? Does striking me in public not raise questions about his character? Zachariah has been a pillar of this community for years," the Reverend replied. "He's made mistakes, certainly, but his contributions to Wallace cannot be overlooked." Before Zoe could respond, a commotion at the church entrance drew their attention. A group of miners had gathered, and among them stood Blake, deep in conversation. "What's happening?" Zoe asked a woman nearby. "Miller's offering jobs at the Blackwell mine," the woman explained. "Wages 15% higher than Morgan's paying, with safer conditions." Reverend Phillips frowned. "This will only escalate tensions in town." As they watched, Zachariah Morgan himself appeared, striding purposefully toward the gathering. The crowd parted nervously as he approached Blake. "Poaching my workers, Miller," Morgan's voice carried across the churchyard. "That's not a wise business strategy." Blake turned to face him, unfazed. "Offering fair wages for honest work. If that's poaching, then your problem isn't with me but with how you treat your employees." Morgan's face reddened. "You think you can come into my town and change the established order? You'll be gone within a month, your mind flooded or worse." "Is that a threat?" Blake asked calmly. "A prediction?" Morgan adjusted his expensive suit jacket. "Men like you come and go, I remain." Zoe moved closer, unwilling to let the confrontation continue without intervening. "Mr. Morgan, this is hardly appropriate conversation for church grounds on the Sabbath." Morgan's gaze shifted to her, his eyes cold. "Miss Cooper, still allowing this outsider to fight your battles?" "I fight my own battles," she replied evenly. "As evidenced by my continued refusal of your proposal, despite your attempts to ruin me." A murmur ran through the watching crowd. Few had ever spoken to Morgan so directly in public. "You could have been the most respected woman in Wallace," Morgan said. "Now look at you, homeless, reputation in tatters, dependent on a stranger's charity." "I have my self-respect," Zoe countered. "Something your wealth can't buy." Morgan's eyes narrowed dangerously. "We'll see how long that sustains you." He turned back to Blake. "As for you, Miller, enjoy your investment while it lasts. The Blackwell claim has always been trouble. There's a reason it remained unsold so long." With that parting shot, Morgan departed, several of the town's prominent citizens following in his wake. Blake watched him go, then turned to the miners still gathered nearby. "My offer stands. Anyone interested can come by the mine office tomorrow morning." As the crowd dispersed, Blake approached Zoe and Mrs. Abernathy. "I apologize for disrupting your Sunday," he said, particularly to Mrs. Abernathy. The older woman chuckled. "No need. Most excitement we've had at church since Preacher Philip's horse got loose during Easter service last year." Blake smiled briefly, then grew serious as he addressed Zoe. "Morgan's becoming more direct in his threats. You should be careful." "Me?" Zoe raised her eyebrows. "He just threatened to sabotage your mine. I'd say you're the one who needs to be careful. I've dealt with men like him before. They usually have more bluster than actual courage." Mrs. Abernathy looked between them. "Why don't you join us for Sunday dinner, Mr. Miller? I've made more than enough." Blake hesitated, then nodded. "I'd be honored, madam." The meal at Mrs. Abernathy's farmhouse was the most relaxed experience Zoe had had in days. The widow was a wonderful cook and an even better conversationalist, regaling them with stories of Wallace's early days when the mining camp was just a collection of tents and rough cabins. "This was Indian territory not so long ago," she explained as they enjoyed apple pie for dessert. "The Coeur d'Alene tribe didn't take kindly to the first prospectors. Can't blame them, considering what happened after silver was discovered." "When did Morgan arrive?" Blake asked, accepting a second piece of pie. "About 10 years back." "Had money already never said from where and bought up claims from miners who didn't have the resources to develop them properly." Mrs. Abernathy sipped her tea. "Smart businessman, I'll give him that. Ruthless but smart." "And no family," Blake pressed. The widow shook her head. "A confirmed bachelor until recently, when he set his sights on our Zoe here." Zoe felt her cheeks warm. "I still don't understand why. There are wealthier, more suitable matches in Coeur d'Alene or even Spokane." "Some men want what they can't easily have," Blake observed. "And some want to possess whatever they consider the finest in their domain." Mrs. Abernathy nodded sagely. "Morgan likes to own things: land, mines, businesses. Likely sees a wife the same way." After dinner, while Mrs. Abernathy rested, Blake helped Zoe wash and dry the dishes, a task she suspected he'd rarely performed before, judging by his awkward handling of the delicate china. "You never mentioned what business brought you to the mine today instead of church," Zoe said, as she handed him another plate to dry. "I was meeting with engineers about reopening the main shaft," he explained. "The Blackwell claim has good potential, but it needs proper equipment and safety measures." "Is that true what Morgan said, about the mine being trouble?" Blake set down the dried plate carefully. "There was a collapse in one section last year. That's partly why Blackwell couldn't find investors before he died, but with proper reinforcement, it can be made safe. And you're really offering higher wages." 15% higher, plus a small share of profits once the mine is producing consistently. He smiled at her skeptical expression. "It's not charity, Zoe. Happy workers are more productive and less likely to cause problems. It's good business." It was the first time he had used her given name, and Zoe found she didn't mind the informality. "You're not what you seem, Blake Miller," she said quietly. "A cowboy wouldn't know about mining engineering or profit-sharing arrangements. I never claimed to be just a cowboy." He hung the dish towel to dry. "I've worked cattle, yes, but I've also invested in mining operations across several territories. My father taught me both businesses. And yet you dress like a ranch hand rather than a businessman." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "People tell you more when they think you're just passing through, and comfortable clothes are better for actual work." Before Zoe could inquire further about his background, a loud knock at the front door interrupted them. Mrs. Abernathy emerged from her room to answer it, returning moments later with Sheriff Taylor. "Evening, Miss Cooper, Mr. Miller," the sheriff said, hat in hand. "Sorry to disturb your Sunday, but there's been an incident at the schoolhouse." Zoe's hand flew to her throat. "What happened?" "Someone broke in, made quite a mess." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "You might want to come see for yourself. It's not good." Blake immediately retrieved his hat and coat. "I'll drive you, Zoe." The schoolhouse was illuminated by lanterns when they arrived. Several townspeople gathered outside. As Zoe entered the single classroom, she gasped in horror. Books had been torn apart, desks overturned, and across the blackboard someone had written in large chalk letters, "Whores don't teach children." "Oh my God," she whispered, surveying the destruction. Blake placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Sheriff, I assume you know who's responsible." Sheriff Taylor shifted uncomfortably. "No witnesses have come forward. But you have suspicions," Blake pressed. "Can't arrest a man on suspicions, Miller." The sheriff gestured at the mess. "Could have been minors drunk after payday, could have been mischievous boys." "It could have been Morgan's men, and you know it," Blake said flatly. The sheriff's expression hardened. "Be careful making accusations without proof. That's how people get hurt in this town." After the sheriff departed, Zoe moved numbly through the classroom, picking up torn books and scattered papers. Several other townspeople helped, including Mrs. Jenkins, whose husband worked for Morgan. "I'm so sorry, Miss Cooper," the woman said quietly as they worked side by side. "This isn't right, no matter what happened between you and Mr. Morgan." "Thank you," Zoe replied, touched by the small act of solidarity. When most of the mess had been cleared, Blake found Zoe sitting at her desk, holding the tattered remains of a book of poetry. "We can replace the books," he said gently. "It's not about the books." Tears filled her eyes. "It's about the message. They're trying to turn the town against me, make parents afraid to let their children near me." "We won't let that happen." She looked up at him. "We?" "Blake, you barely know me. You shouldn't be dragged into this ugliness." "I'm already involved," he reminded her. "And I don't abandon people who need help." "Because of what happened to your sister?" she asked softly. His expression grew distant. "Partly. But also because it's the right thing to do." He offered his hand. "Come on. You need rest. Tomorrow we'll see how many children return to school." The answer came the next morning when Zoe arrived to find only 8 of her usual 22 students waiting. By midweek, the number had dwindled to 5, mostly children of independent shopkeepers and farmers not directly dependent on Morgan's mines. Friday afternoon, as Zoe dismissed her small class, the chairman of the school board appeared at the door. "Miss Cooper," Edwards said, removing his hat. "Might we speak privately?" Zoe's heart sank. She had been expecting this visit. "Of course, Mr. Edwards." Once the children had departed, Edwards took a seat opposite her desk. "I'll be direct. The board is concerned about declining attendance. The children will return when their parents realize the incident wasn't my fault," Zoe replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Perhaps. But in the meantime, we have an obligation to provide education to all Wallace children." Edwards placed his folded hands on the desk. "The board has voted to suspend your position until this matter resolves itself. We'll be bringing in a substitute teacher from Coeur d'Alene next week." Zoe felt as if she'd been struck. "I see. And if attendance returns to normal with a different teacher, will my suspension become permanent?" "That would be the logical conclusion, yes." She fought back tears. Teaching was more than her livelihood, it was her passion, her purpose. "Is there anything I can say to change the board's decision?" Edwards hesitated. "There is one possibility. Mr. Morgan has indicated that if you were to reconsider his proposal, he would use his influence to restore normalcy to the town." Zoe stared at him in disbelief. "You're suggesting I marry a man I despise to keep my teaching position." "I'm merely conveying information," Edward said, rising from his chair. "The decision, of course, is yours." "Good day, Miss Cooper." After he left, Zoe remained at her desk, numb with shock and grief. When Blake arrived to escort her back to Mrs. Abernathy's, he immediately sensed something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, taking in her pale face and reddened eyes. "I've been suspended," she said flatly. "Apparently, I'm no longer fit to teach Wallace's children." Blake's expression darkened. "Morgan's work. Who else? He's systematically taking everything from me, my home, my reputation, and now my career." She looked up at him, desperation in her eyes. "What will I do? Teaching is all I know." "We'll fight this," Blake promised. "Morgan can't control the entire territory. There are other towns, other schools. Leave Wallace. This has been my home for 3 years." The thought of fleeing felt like admitting defeat. "Sometimes tactical retreat is the wisest strategy," Blake said. "It doesn't mean giving up the fight." Zoe gathered her personal items from the desk, including a small framed photograph of her parents, both long deceased. "The board chairman made it clear that Morgan would restore everything if I accept his proposal." Blake's voice was hard. "And is that what you're considering?" "No," she said firmly. "Never. But I can't help wondering if my principles are worth the cost. Not just to me, but to the children losing their education." "Your principles are precisely what make you the teacher those children need," Blake said. "What lesson would it teach them if you surrendered to bullying and coercion?" As they left the schoolhouse, perhaps for the last time, Zoe realized that, despite the pain of her situation, she felt a certain freedom. Morgan had taken almost everything, yet she still had her dignity and her freedom to choose. And unexpectedly, she had Blake Miller standing beside her. That evening, Mrs. Abernathy invited several neighbors for dinner, farmers and small business owners whose livelihoods didn't depend directly on Morgan's mines. The conversation inevitably turned to the situation in town. "Morgan's gone too far this time," declared Samuel Wilson, who owned the town's hardware store. "Targeting a schoolteacher because she wouldn't marry him, it's unconscionable." "But what can anyone do?" asked his wife, Martha. "He controls the mines, the bank, even influences the territorial officials." "Not everyone's afraid of him," Mrs. Abernathy said, nodding toward Blake. "Mr. Miller here has already shown that Morgan can be challenged." Blake, who had been quietly listening, set down his coffee cup. "One man alone can't change the power structure in Wallace, but a community working together might." "What do you propose?" Samuel asked. "Morgan's strength comes from his mining monopoly," Blake explained. "But the Blackwell mine is now operational and hiring. If enough skilled workers shift allegiance, his production will suffer." Martha Wilson shook her head skeptically. "He'll just bring in workers from outside." "Not easily," Blake countered. "Experienced silver miners are in demand across the territories. And new workers would need housing, which Morgan controls, but only in town." "You're suggesting building new housing?" Samuel looked intrigued. "Near the Blackwell mine," Blake confirmed. "Independent housing, not company-owned. Men who live in homes they're purchasing themselves are less easily intimidated." Zoe, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "And what about the school? The children need education, regardless of where their fathers work." Blake smiled at her. "I was thinking we might need a new school as well. One not controlled by Morgan's school board." The conversation continued late into the evening, with plans taking shape for what amounted to a new community center around the Blackwell mine. When the guests departed, there was a sense of cautious optimism in the air. After helping Mrs. Abernathy clear the table, Zoe joined Blake on the front porch, where he stood gazing at the stars visible above the distant mountains. "You've been planning this all along, haven't you?" she asked. Creating an alternative to Morgan's control of Wallace. Blake nodded slowly. "The idea formed when I first researched the area's mining prospects. Morgan's domination of the town was a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. And I provided the perfect opportunity," Zoe realized. "My confrontation with him gave you a public reason to challenge his authority. Your situation accelerated my timeline," Blake admitted. "But I would have moved against Morgan eventually. Men like him stifle progress and innovation with their need for control." Zoe studied his profile in the moonlight. "You're a remarkable man, Blake Miller, far more than you appear at first glance." He turned to face her. "As are you a remarkable woman, Zoe Cooper. Most would have yielded to Morgan's pressure long ago." "Not if they knew what I know about him," she said quietly. "I've seen how he treats those who disappoint him. One of my students, her father, was injured in a mine collapse last year. Morgan cut off their credit at the company store when the man couldn't return to work quickly enough. The family nearly starved before neighbors began helping secretly." Blake's jaw tightened. "All the more reason to break his hold on Wallace." "You really think it's possible?" "I know it is," he said with conviction. "It will take time, investment, and courage from folks who have been afraid too long. But it can be done." Zoe hesitated, then asked the question that had been troubling her. "And when it's done, will you stay or move on to another town that needs saving?" Blake didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was contemplative. "I've been moving from place to place for years, building businesses, making investments, then selling and moving on. It's a solitary existence." "It sounds lonely," Zoe observed. "It has been," he acknowledged. "But lately I've been thinking about putting down roots, finding a place worth staying for." The implication hung in the air between them. Zoe felt her heart quicken, but before she could respond, Mrs. Abernathy called from inside that a bath had been prepared for her. "Good night, Blake," she said softly. He touched the brim of his hat. "Good night, Zoe. Sleep well." The following week brought dramatic changes to Wallace. True to his word, Blake began construction on housing near the Blackwell mine, employing local carpenters and offering favorable terms to miners willing to leave Morgan's employment. A small but steady stream of workers made the shift, attracted by better wages and the prospect of home ownership. Morgan retaliated by reducing wages at his own operations and threatening to evict any employee who associated with Blake or patronized businesses friendly to him. The town began to divide, with tension growing daily. Zoe found new purpose organizing educational services for the children of families who had aligned with Blake. Using Mrs. Abernathy's front parlor as a makeshift classroom, she continued teaching, now free from the constraints of the official curriculum. One afternoon, as her small class practiced arithmetic, a commotion outside drew her attention. Through the window, she saw Blake riding up to the house at a gallop, his expression urgent. Dismissing the children early, she met him at the door. "What's happened?" she asked, alarmed by his appearance. "Morgan's men tried to sabotage the mine," Blake said grimly. "They damaged the pumping equipment overnight. If it hadn't been discovered quickly, the main shaft would have flooded." "Was anyone hurt?" "Thankfully, no, but it's an escalation. Until now, the conflict has been economic and social. This was potentially lethal." Zoe led him inside, where Mrs. Abernathy provided coffee and listened with growing concern. "Have you spoken with the sheriff?" the widow asked. Blake's expression was cynical. "Sheriff Taylor said he'd look into it, but without witnesses willing to testify, there's little he can do. Or will do," Zoe added bitterly. "I've hired additional security for the mine," Blake continued, but I'm concerned about retaliation elsewhere, particularly here, Mrs. Abernathy straightened her spine. My late husband left me a fine shotgun, Mr. Miller. I know how to use it. I don't doubt your courage, Mrs. Abernathy, Blake said with a small smile, but I'd prefer not to put you and Zoe at risk. I've arranged alternative accommodation in the new housing development. The first 2 homes are nearly complete. Zoe shook her head. We can't leave Mrs. Abernathy alone. You won't be, Blake assured her. I've invited Martha Wilson and her husband to stay here temporarily. Samuel's store has been losing business due to Morgan's pressure, and they've decided to relocate to the new settlement. Their presence here will provide safety in numbers. The plan was sensible, but Zoe felt a tinge of guilt. We're dividing the town, forcing people to choose sides. Morgan forced that choice, Blake reminded her. We're just providing an alternative to complete submission. Later that day, Zoe reluctantly packed her belongings once again. As she prepared to leave with Blake, she embraced Mrs. Abernathy warmly. Thank you for everything, she said. I don't know what I would have done without your kindness. Nonsense, dear, the widow replied briskly. You brought life back to this old house. And besides, she added with a twinkle in her eye, being part of a rebellion against Zachariah Morgan is the most excitement I've had in decades. The new settlement, which workers had begun calling Miller's Crossing, was taking shape rapidly. A dozen small houses were in various stages of construction around a central area designated for community buildings. The 2 completed homes stood side by side near the edge of the development. This one will be yours, Blake said, showing Zoe into the smaller of the 2 houses. Though modest in size, it featured new furniture, clean curtains, and a small stove for heating and cooking. It's lovely, she said, genuinely impressed. But I can't afford. Consider it part of your compensation, Blake interrupted. We need a teacher here. The position includes housing. You've thought of everything, Zoe murmured, running her hand along the back of a rocking chair positioned near the single window. Not everything, Blake admitted. This is still very fragile. If Morgan manages to shut down the mine or scare away enough workers, it all falls apart. Zoe turned to face him. Then we won't let that happen. The determination in her voice brought a smile to his face. No, we won't. As weeks passed, Miller's Crossing continued to grow. A simple building was erected to serve as both school and community gathering place. More families arrived, some from Wallace, others from more distant mining communities attracted by the favorable conditions Blake offered. Zachariah Morgan's attempts to crush the upstart settlement intensified. He pressured suppliers in Coeur d'Alene to refuse business with Blake, forcing them to source materials from as far away as Spokane. When that failed to halt progress, more direct methods followed. One night in late October, Zoe was awakened by shouting and the smell of smoke. Throwing a shawl over her nightdress, she rushed outside to find the newly completed schoolhouse ablaze, with residents forming a bucket line from the nearby creek. Blake, his face smudged with soot, was directing the firefighting efforts. Despite their best attempts, by dawn the building was reduced to smoldering ruins. As the exhausted residents gathered to survey the damage, Blake's expression was grim but determined. Morgan thinks this will break us, he announced to the assembled crowd. He thinks without a school, families will return to Wallace. He's wrong. We'll rebuild stronger and larger than before. A cheer went up from the tired firefighters. Zoe, watching from the edge of the crowd, felt a surge of pride in their resilience. Later, as they shared coffee in her small kitchen, Blake outlined his plan to not only rebuild the school but expand the entire settlement. I've contacted investors in Denver and San Francisco, he explained. With additional capital, We can develop the Blackwell mine faster, hire more workers, and accelerate construction." Zoe listened with growing excitement, but also concern. Morgan won't stop. If anything, he'll become more desperate as Miller's Crossing grows. "I'm counting on it," Blake said, a hard edge to his voice. "The more openly he acts against us, the more he exposes himself to legal consequences." "You want him to incriminate himself," Zoe realized. Blake nodded. "Territorial authorities have been watching Morgan for some time. They suspect his operation isn't entirely legitimate, but they've lacked evidence and local cooperation." "And you've been working with them." Zoe was surprised by this revelation. "Let's say our interests align," Blake replied carefully. "I want to build a profitable mining operation. They want to end Morgan's stranglehold on the region. Sometimes justice and business make good partners." As winter approached, tension between the two communities continued to escalate. The rebuilt schoolhouse opened just as snow began dusting the mountains surrounding the valley. Inside, Zoe taught nearly 30 children more than she had ever had in Wallace. The success of Miller's Crossing clearly infuriated Morgan. When economic pressure and intimidation failed to stem the tide of defections from Wallace, he resorted to more dangerous tactics. Shipments of supplies were hijacked, workers traveling between the communities were beaten, and anonymous threats were delivered to prominent residents of the new settlement. Blake responded by hiring more security and establishing regular patrols. The once peaceful mining region began to resemble a war zone, with armed men on both sides watching each other warily across an invisible boundary. Despite the tension, or perhaps because of it, the relationship between Zoe and Blake deepened. They spent most evenings together, sometimes discussing plans for the community, other times simply enjoying each other's company. Neither spoke openly of their growing feelings, but the residents of Miller's Crossing had already begun treating them as a couple. On a cold December evening, Zoe was grading papers by lamplight when an urgent knock came at her door. Opening it, she found Samuel Wilson, his face grave. "Blake's been shot," he said without preamble. "He's at the mine office. Doc Sanders is with him." The world seemed to tilt beneath Zoe's feet. How bad? Bad enough. He was ambushed on the road from Coeur d'Alene, took a bullet in the shoulder. Zoe grabbed her coat and followed Samuel through the snow-covered settlement to the small building that served as the mine's administrative office. Inside, she found Blake lying on a cot, his face pale but conscious. Dr. Sanders, who had relocated to Miller's Crossing the previous month, was bandaging his shoulder. "You shouldn't be here," Blake said when he saw her, trying unsuccessfully to sit up. "Be still," she ordered, moving to his side. "What happened?" "Two riders," Blake replied through gritted teeth. "Masked. They fired from the trees near Thompson Creek. Morgan's men," Samuel said flatly. Blake shook his head slightly. "No proof of that. We don't need proof," Samuel argued. "Everyone knows who's responsible." Dr. Sanders finished securing the bandage. "The bullet went clean through. He's lucky no bones shattered, but he's lost blood and needs rest." "He can stay with me," Zoe said immediately. "My house is closer than his, and I can watch over him." The doctor nodded approval. "Good idea. He shouldn't be alone for at least a couple of days. I'll help you get him there." With Samuel's assistance, they managed to transport Blake to Zoe's small house, settling him in her bed despite his protests that he could make it to his own home. "Stop being stubborn," Zoe chided as she adjusted pillows behind him. "You've been shot. You're staying here where I can keep an eye on you." After the doctor departed with instructions for caring for the wound, Zoe sat beside the bed, studying Blake's face in the lamplight. The pain had etched lines around his eyes and mouth, but his gaze was clear as he looked up at her. "This isn't how I imagined getting invited to your bedroom," he said with a weak attempt at humor. Despite her worry, Zoe smiled. Apparently, you needed to be shot before I'd bring you home. His expression grew serious. Zoe, if something happens to me, nothing will happen to you, she interrupted firmly. You're going to heal and then we're going to finish what we started. Morgan won't win. Blake reached for her hand with his uninjured arm. You should know. The mine is structured so that if anything happens to me, ownership transfers to a trust. You're named as the primary trustee. Zoe stared at him in shock. Me? But why? Because I trust you. Because you understand what we're building here isn't just about silver or profit, it's about freedom from men like Morgan. His fingers tightened around hers. And because somewhere along the way, you became the most important person in my life. The simple declaration hung in the air between them. Zoe felt tears welling in her eyes. When did that happen? She asked softly. I think it began the moment you stood up to Morgan in the town hall, Blake said. But I didn't realize it until later, maybe the day you started teaching in Mrs. Abernathy's parlor, refusing to let Morgan take that from you too. Zoe leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently against his. You impossible man. Getting shot is a terrible way to finally confess your feelings. I've never claimed to have good timing, he murmured, his free hand moving to cup her cheek. When their lips met, it felt like the culmination of everything they had built together, not just the settlement, but the trust and respect that had grown between them despite the chaos surrounding them. Blake's recovery was slow but steady. Zoe divided her time between teaching and nursing him back to health, with community members stepping in to help with both responsibilities. By Christmas, he was able to move about with the aid of a sling, though the doctor insisted he avoid strenuous activity. The holiday brought a rare moment of peace to Miller's Crossing. The community gathered in the rebuilt schoolhouse, decorated with pine boughs and homemade ornaments, for a celebration that served as both Christmas observance and affirmation of their shared purpose. Blake, still pale but standing tall, addressed the assembled residents. 6 months ago, this land was empty, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Now look what we've built together: homes, businesses, a school. We've created not just a settlement, but a community based on fairness and mutual respect. Cheers and applause interrupted him. When it subsided, he continued. Zachariah Morgan believes he can destroy what we've built through fear and violence. He's wrong. Each attack only strengthens our resolve. He reached for Zoe's hand, drawing her to his side. Miss Cooper and I have an announcement, he said, smiling down at her. We intend to marry at the new year. We'd be honored if you would all join us in celebration. The response was immediate and joyous. As congratulations poured in from all sides, Zoe leaned close to Blake. That was rather public for a proposal, she whispered, though her eyes shone with happiness. I thought you deserved something better than Morgan's approach, he replied. Though I realize I probably should have asked you privately first. I already knew my answer, she assured him. I've known for some time. The wedding took place on New Year's Day, 1883, with Reverend Collins recently arrived from Spokane after hearing of the growing community performing the ceremony. Despite the continued tensions with Wallace, the day passed peacefully, with even a few brave souls from the original town slipping away to attend. As Zoe and Blake exchanged vows in the schoolhouse-turned-chapel, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From her public humiliation at Morgan's hands, to finding unexpected strength and purpose in helping build a new community, and in the process, finding a partner who valued her independence rather than seeking to control it. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music, dancing, and more food than the small community had seen since its founding. As night fell, Blake led Zoe through the snow to his house, now their house the larger of the two original buildings at Miller's Crossing. "Welcome home, Mrs. Miller," he said, lifting her across the threshold despite the lingering weakness in his injured shoulder. "Careful," she admonished, though she couldn't suppress her smile. "You'll reopen your wound." "Worth the risk," he replied, setting her gently on her feet in the warm interior. A fire crackled in the hearth, and someone, likely Mrs. Wilson, had decorated the main room with evergreen boughs and candles. As they stood together in the firelight, Blake's expression grew serious. "I want you to know," he said, taking both her hands in his, "that I never intended to stay in Wallace when I first arrived. I was investigating the mining prospects, yes, but I planned to develop the property and then sell it, as I've done elsewhere." "What changed?" Zoe asked, though she thought she knew the answer. "You," he said simply. "Watching you stand your ground against Morgan, refusing to be intimidated even when he took everything from you, it made me want to be worthy of that kind of courage." Zoe reached up to touch his face. "You were already worthy. You stood up for me when no one else would." "No one forces you into anything again," Blake said softly, repeating the promise he'd made that first day. "Not Morgan, not this town, and not me. Whatever we build together, we build as equals." "I would accept nothing less," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to seal the promise with a kiss. Spring brought new growth to Miller's Crossing, both literally and figuratively. The Blackwell mine was producing consistently, with a second shaft now operational and profits exceeding even Blake's optimistic projections. The settlement had expanded to over 50 buildings, with new residents arriving weekly. Zachariah Morgan's influence, meanwhile, was waning. Several of his smaller mines had closed due to lack of workers, and rumors circulated that he was deeply in debt to Eastern investors who were growing impatient with diminishing returns. In April, territorial officials arrived unexpectedly in Wallace, accompanied by federal marshals. Within days, Morgan was arrested on charges of fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy related to the attacks on Miller's Crossing. Evidence provided by former associates, including his own bookkeeper, proved damning. The news reached Zoe as she was dismissing her afternoon class. Blake arrived at the schoolhouse, his face alight with vindication. "It's over," he announced. "Morgan's being transported to Boys for trial. The marshals found documentation in his office linking him directly to the attempts to sabotage our mine and the schoolhouse fire." Zoe felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief, satisfaction, but also a strange emptiness. Their common enemy, the threat that had united them and the community, was gone. "What happens now?" she asked. "To Wallace, to Miller's Crossing." Blake took her hand as they walked toward home. "I've been thinking about that. The two communities have been divided too long. With Morgan gone, there's an opportunity for reconciliation." "You want to reunite the settlements?" Zoe was surprised. "Not exactly. I'm proposing we incorporate as a single new town, with representatives from both communities forming the government. No one man controlling everything, a true democratic structure." The idea was ambitious but appealing. Over the following months, negotiations between leaders of both settlements proceeded cautiously but productively. By summer, a framework for unification had been established, with elections scheduled for fall. In June, as the mountains bloomed with wildflowers, Zoe shared news of her own with Blake. "The doctor confirmed it today," she told him as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset. "We're going to have a baby, likely around Christmas." The joy that spread across Blake's face was like nothing she'd seen before, not even when the mine struck a particularly rich vein or when Morgan was led away in handcuffs. "A baby," he repeated, wrapping his arms around her. "Our own family. Are you happy?" She asked, though his reaction made the question almost unnecessary. "Happier than I ever thought possible," he assured her. "When I rode into Wallace that day and saw a schoolteacher standing up to the most powerful man in town, I never imagined where it would lead." Zoe leaned against his shoulder, contemplating the future stretching before them. Sometimes the best journeys are the ones we don't plan. By December 1883, the unified town now officially named Silverton was thriving. The election had resulted in a balanced council with representatives from both former settlements. Blake had declined nomination as mayor, preferring to focus on mining operations and his growing family. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell gently outside their window, Zoe gave birth to a healthy son they named James, after Blake's father. As she held their child with Blake beside her on the bed, she reflected on the extraordinary year that had transformed her life. "What are you thinking about?" Blake asked, gently stroking their son's tiny hand. "About how differently things might have turned out," she replied. "If you hadn't been in that town hall when Morgan struck me, if you hadn't said those words." "No one forces you into anything again," Blake recalled softly. "You kept that promise," Zoe said, looking up at him with eyes shining. "You gave me choices when Morgan tried to take them away. You never asked me to be less than who I am." "I fell in love with who you are," Blake said simply. "Why would I want to change that?" Outside, carolers moved through the streets of the new town, their voices carrying on the crisp winter air. Inside, a new family celebrated their first Christmas together, a family built not on obligation or control, but on respect, admiration, and love freely given. 5 years later, the town of Silverton celebrated its anniversary with a summer festival that drew visitors from throughout the territory. The main street was decorated with bunting and flags, and tables laden with food stretched the length of the town square. Zoe Miller, now mother to 3-year-old James and 1-year-old Elizabeth, watched the festivities from the porch of the town's expanded schoolhouse, where she served as headmistress. Pregnancy had temporarily slowed her pace. Their third child was due in autumn, but not her enthusiasm for the community they had built. Blake joined her, carrying Elizabeth on his shoulders while James ran ahead to join other children playing nearby. "Quite a celebration," he remarked, setting their daughter down to toddle toward her mother. "Hard to believe how much has changed." "Sometimes I hardly recognize this place," Zoe agreed, taking Elizabeth onto her lap. "Remember when it was just a few cabins and tents?" "I remember when it was just an idea," Blake said, his eyes reflecting the contentment of a man who had found his purpose. "An alternative to Morgan's way of doing things." The former mine owner remained a cautionary tale in Silverton's short history. After conviction on multiple charges, he had been sentenced to 15 years in prison. His properties, seized to satisfy debts and legal judgments, had been acquired by various investors including Blake, who now operated 3 productive mines in the district. "Mrs. Miller." A young woman approached the porch, smiling broadly. "The children want to start the pageant. Are you feeling well enough to direct?" "Of course, Miss Jenkins," Zoe replied, carefully rising with Elizabeth in her arms. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." As Zoe organized the children for their performance, a historical tableau depicting the founding of Silverton Blake watched with quiet pride. His wife's strength and determination had never wavered from that first confrontation in Wallace's town hall to her current role as one of the most respected women in the community. The pageant concluded with James, dressed as a miniature version of his father, complete with a too large cowboy hat, reciting the town motto, "Founded in freedom, built on respect." Later, as twilight descended and lanterns illuminated the continuing celebration, Blake and Zoe walked slowly through the town square, greeting friends and neighbors. They paused near the stone monument recently erected to commemorate the town's founding. "You ever regret it?" Blake asked suddenly. "Standing up to Morgan that day, your life might have been easier if you just left town quietly." Zoe considered the question seriously. "Easier, perhaps, but not mine. I would have been living someone else's life, a life of compromise and submission." She smiled up at him. "Instead, I found the strength to build something better, and I found you." Blake squeezed her hand gently. "I came to Idaho looking for silver. I found something far more valuable." As night fell over Silverton, the family returned home to the house that had expanded along with their family, on the street where Blake had built the first 2 cabins of what became Miller's Crossing. In the nursery, as they tucked their children into bed, James asked for the story he never tired of hearing. "Tell about when Papa saved Mama from the bad man," he requested sleepily. Blake chuckled. "That's not quite how it happened. Your Mama was already saving herself. I just helped a little." "Tell it anyway," Zoe encouraged, settling into a rocking chair with Elizabeth already dozing against her shoulder. And so Blake began the tale that had become family legend of a schoolteacher who refused to be bullied, of a stranger who recognized her courage, and of the community they built together out of adversity and hope. Outside their window, Silverton continued its celebration, a testament to what could be accomplished when people stood together against intimidation and control. Inside, surrounded by the family that had grown from an unexpected alliance, Blake and Zoe Miller had created something even more precious, a home where choices were respected, strength was valued, and love was freely given. No one had forced Zoe Cooper into anything again. And in choosing her own path, choosing Blake, she had found freedom and happiness beyond anything she could have imagined that fateful day in Wallace, Idaho, when she had the courage to say no.